So it's almost been 2 weeks since Phase 2 of Season of Discovery dropped, and so I kind of wanted to take a second to kind of go over my experiences and give you my first impressions. So at the end of Phase 1, I had 4 different 25s, a rogue, druid, mage, and a warrior. I didn't really do much on the latter two, aside from just questing and rune collecting and then making some Weakauras for them, so the first two, the druid and the rogue, ended up being my mains. Now, when you look at some of the other videos I've made on the channel, it might look like I'm a total rogue main, and while I did level the rogue first, I ended up putting a lot more time into the feral druid, so heading into Phase 2, I decided to level them first. Now, I missed the initial launch of Phase 2 by a little over half an hour or so, but as soon as I got in, I decided to run a BFD for XP, and for one last chance at getting Smorgasbord's mace. Spoiler, the mace didn't drop, but I did get almost a full level just from the raid alone. I then went immediately into stocks until 27, and then did some questing in Duskwood and Wetlands. That was a lot less efficient though, so eventually I went back into stocks until around level 30, and then I finally went to go get my cozy sleeping bag. Unfortunately, I was kind of dumb and didn't think to record that whole process, and if I did, I probably would have made a guide for it and had it out before Wowheads. But once I'd obtained that, I headed over to Scarlet Monastery and started spamming library. At 34, I tried again to do a bit of questing, this time in South Shore, but there ended up being a lot of competition, and like before, it was just super inefficient, so back to SM I went. And SM is where I stayed all the rest of the way till 40. You know, for the first few hours, it was fine. I was having a blast. I was feral too, so I didn't have any trouble finding any groups. And we just kind of blazed through library and then armory and then eventually the dreaded cathedral. At some point in the middle there, I did go out and get the King of the Jungle rune from the Dark Riders, but again, I was dumb and didn't think to get footage of that. But at this point, I was pretty burnt out, but like the idiot I am, I continued to run it over and over and over. It still wasn't the worst thing in the world. I was still having fun to some extent, but holy crap was that last level just absolutely miserable. I think I'd already been playing for like 5 hours or something that day, but I just couldn't stop when I was so close. I had to finish it, and finish it I did. I hit 40 right there in the cathedral, killed the boss, and I have not been back to Scarlet Monastery ever since.
I can finally leave!
Now, I know it probably sounds like I'm being kind of critical, but I will admit that this issue was entirely my own fault. I could have just taken my time, done a bunch of questing, found my runes as I went along, and I'm sure I would have had a lot of fun that way. However, I have a bit of a problem where whenever there's a new launch, my brain just devolves into giga sweaty speedrun mode. Now, I'm certainly not a speedrunner. I don't really time my level splits or anything like that, and my 20 to 40 time was probably miles behind the professionals. But I still just think it's a lot of fun to go as fast as I can. But what's interesting about this is I didn't really have this whole burnout issue with Phase 1. So what's the difference here? It really boils down to the fact that in Phase 1, there just weren't that many dungeons to spam. I guess you could start doing dead mines at like 16 or something like that and just spam that to 25 if you want, but the whole 1 to 25 felt a lot smoother because there was so much more reliance on the open world leading up to the dungeons. And even if you only did the dungeons for the quests, it was still entirely viable to level in the open world at a really fast pace. But with Phase 2, we have stocks and SM right off the bat, which are insanely good dungeons for leveling. So instead of questing like a normal person, I ended up grinding dungeons like a lunatic, not just because it felt so much faster, but because it was so much faster. And really, it's not the worst thing in the world. I did have a ton of fun for most of it, but I will admit that with the amount of time it took to level from 25 to 40, even with the speed of SM spam being taken into account, I started to feel a lot less incentivized to level multiple characters. Since Phase 1 was so much faster, I had enough time to level 4 25s and get a 5th character all the way to 19, and that was just with a few hours every day. And I just thought that was totally awesome, because it gave me plenty of time to explore a handful of classes, get all their runes, and even gear them up a little bit. Now in Phase 2, with how much more time it takes to get all the way to 40, leveling multiple characters seems like a lot more of a daunting task. And this kind of ties into my next point. There's really not a whole lot of stuff to do at 40. Now that might not sound like it connects to my last point, but give me a second and I'll explain. In Phase 1, once you hit 25, there was quite a lot for you to get done. You needed to get all your runes, or at least just the ones for your spec, grind several different dungeons to get your Priebus, do your professions, run a BFD every lockout, there was the Ashenvale PvP event, and then there was Warsong Gulch. Now you didn't need to do all of that, but the options were always there, and for the most part, there was always a good incentive to do each of these things. And the reason why I liked this so much was because it gave you just enough things to do at 25, so once you finally reached that point of comfort on a max level character, you were totally refreshed and ready to get back into leveling with an alt. In Phase 2, however, we have half the amount of runes to collect, and our gear is just so cracked that we barely even need to collect Priebus. And if you do, you could probably just buy it on the auction house. And even then, the gear in Gnomer isn't even that much of an upgrade. Sure, you can do your professions in the STV event, but once you get your epic item from it, which doesn't really take that long, there's really just no reason to continue doing it unless you just really like PvP or want to go for the mount. So now that I'm level 40, I feel less incentivized to interact with endgame content, but I'm also also not quite to the point where I feel ready to jump back into leveling, because I'm still kind of mentally recovering from Scarlet Monastery, and I know that if I don't do Scarlet Monastery, it's going to take even longer. But enough about that, I suppose. Let's get into the big question. How is the PvP event, and how is the raid? The Stranglethorn PvP event is surprisingly fun. Sure, you'll never get anything done as a solo player, so you'll always need to find a 5-man group, but even so, it's still really cool. Everyone in the zone, aside from your party members, turn hostile, and after every kill, you gain stacks of blood that you need to turn in at altars scattered in specific locations around the map. On one hand, it's the most chaotic thing ever devised by Blizzard, and half the time you'll just end up dying over and over, but when it works, it really works. And I say that with full confidence, even considering the fact that I farmed this event before the Balanced Druid and Shadow Priest nerfs, and before they changed the Bloodless debuff to where it makes you invisible. I played Feral Druid throughout this whole thing, and even with the Meteor Chickens throwing out orbital strikes and the Emo Priests one-shotting you with Shadow Word Death, I still had a ton of fun running around with a group of 4 other people, just picking people off wherever we could. I will say that it's absolutely awful as a melee player if you're trying to fight anywhere that doesn't have places to break LOS, but if you pick a good location, it's just a total blast. I don't have a lot of footage from the event, but my favorite strategy was to start in Booty Bay because of how many walls and layers there were, stay there until it cleared out, and then move on to the Gurubashi Arena. And the arena was really cool because if you can get past that initial checkpoint, you can just use the walls as cover and then pick people off as they run in to turn in their blood. Another pretty fun strategy that I used in the last event I participated in before getting my mace was to stack 5 players with stealth. We had 2 feral druids and 3 rogues, and to just ambush people one at a time. We had no healing and we died like a million times, but we still got plenty of blood and it was just amazing. But like I mentioned before, it really doesn't take that long to get your rewards. Sure, you can keep going for the mount, or if you want to get the other epics if you ever feel like switching your spec, but since I didn't really care about that, once I got my mace, I didn't really have a reason to keep running the event. Yes, it was very fun, but ultimately, I'm not a huge PvP person. It's very fun here and there, but it's not really my main preference, as I prefer to spend most of my time doing PvE. And that ties me into my final topic, Gnomeregan. I don't like Gnomeregan. There's always just been something about it, maybe just because I'm a feral druid and I hated farming automatic crowd pummeler back in original classic, but even as I leveled other characters, it was always just that one dungeon where I was just like, I guess I'll just do it for the quest that gives you the Trip Runner pants. Really, it's just long, it's boring, and to be honest, I don't like gnomes, or mechs, or leprosy, I guess. But that aside, I did try to go in with my hopes up specifically for the boss mechanics. And you know what? A few of them are pretty good. I really like how you need to manage the trash on Grubbus by cutting them into the gas clouds. Discus Fallout is pretty chill. The crowd pummeler fight is a lot of fun. But then there's just the entire rest of the raid that I hate. As a melee player, Electrocutioner is just so stupid, because all I really have to worry about is sitting there and damaging him. However, for half the fight, I just have to stand in the corner because he likes to spam me with the stupid negative charge or whatever. So I either sit there and DPS like normal, or stand there and do nothing while the ranged are constantly shifting around in groups trying to avoid whatever his other mechanic is. Then there's the mechanical menagerie. On paper, it sounds really cool. 4 different bosses, each with their own little mechanics. Now, I've always been a fan of the more complicated boss fights in retail, but in practice, this one is a total nightmare. There's just so many moving parts all happening at once that it almost doesn't feel like a classic fight. So when half the raid team doesn't pay attention to one little detail, everything gets screwed up. And when it's like a 5-minute fight, every wipe gets more frustrating than the last. In the footage I recorded, we ended up having to use 3 different tanks just to cheese the fight and separate all the mechanics, and even then things still went wrong. It's healing intensive, your tanks always need to know where every other boss is, and your DPS need to have enough restraint to stop damaging specific bosses so that all 4 can die at the same time. But other than that, like, I don't know what else to say. I just think it's an awful fight, and it's not fun. And last but not least, we've got Thermoplug. And once again, all the responsibility in the fight goes to the ranged and the tanks. As a melee DPS, all I have to do is follow the boss around and avoid crap on the floor. That's it. There's nothing special about it. And all the while, the tanks are trying to position the boss in the right spot, swapping for stacks, the healers are doing typical healer things, and the ranged are scurrying around like rats trying to manage the whole pillar mechanic. But that aside, what's the rewards for all this? Like, is the loot at least cool? Like, what are the pieces I'm trying to hope for every single run? Well, as a feral druid, there's Crowd Pummeler, and it's nice that they updated it so that it no longer only has 3 charges, so I won't have to farm it. But really, my Stranglethorn mace is just way better, except for the on-use. So I'll just swap to that one for the on-use, and then immediately swap once the effect is over, and like I'll never use it for anything else. What about the tier set though? We've got a chest with random stats, legs with a bit of crit, so that's kind of nice. And then we've got shoes that give increased stealth level. Okay, what about the bonus? Gotta be nice, right? No, just a little more crit, 20 AP, that's it. Oh, there's also increased dagger skill though. That'll probably come in handy as a feral druid. Now, jokes aside, I know that all makes it sound like I totally hate phase two, but I really don't. I have to say that a lot of this is just me being a bit overly dramatic, but I really am having a ton of fun. More so than I ever have in Wrath, Burning Crusade, and regular Classic. I think the main point I'm trying to make here though is that compared to just how absolutely fantastic phase one was for me, phase two has just been a little underwhelming in comparison. Even so, I'm still really happy about phase two. It's totally amazing to see Blizzard actually taking these big risks and experimenting again. SoD was something I would have never expected in a million years, and to see them trial this new stuff, especially something as crazy as the free-for-all STV event, and then just seeing how communicative the devs have been over the past few months about any of the issues they run into, specific changes they need to make, and just their design philosophy in general, is just so awesome to see, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what's next. Not just for phase 3 or 4, I just know level 60 is just gonna go complete sicko mode, but I'm also curious to see what happens even after SoD. In my opinion, I have no idea how they'll top Season of Discovery, but since we know that they've decided on making this a seasonal server, they've got to have plans for something in the future, and I really can't wait to see what those are. But yeah, the phase 2, it's not quite what I was expecting, but it is still very early, and I'm sure that as time passes and as I get more classes leveled, that I'll come back to this video and think, man, what an idiot I was. But who knows? We'll just have to wait and see. That's pretty much it though. That's all I've got for this one, so thank you. Oh yeah, and the buff feral druid.